Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Strategic Planning for Your Strategic Plan webinar. Your presenters today are going to be Scott Atwell and Barney Ellis-Perry. If you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and Scott and Barney will be answering those either throughout the presentation or be addressing those at the end. With that being said, let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Scott and Barney.
All right, Griffin, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, perhaps even good evening, depending on where you are at, because I know we have some listeners in the UK, but whatever time zone you're in, I'm Scott Atwell, Senior Vice President and Co-Practice Area Leader for Alumni Relations at Grinzenbach Lear & Associates, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-leader, Barney Ellis-Perry, and we welcome you to this session of strategic planning. Of course, a critical tool for any organization, but especially for those with very large constituencies. You know, when I first got into the alumni relations business, one of the real legends of the profession gave me some sage advice. He said, Scott, there is no shortage of good ideas, only the people and the resources to implement them. And if you don't have a strategic roadmap, you can easily feel as if you're on a hamster wheel, working hard, but getting nowhere.
Good morning. Good morning from LA. This is Barney. So our goal in this webinar is to give you practical advice about how to start a strategic plan, complete a strategic plan, and implement that very same strategic plan. This webinar application allows you to send us questions, and we really hope that you'll do that, and we will try and answer them as we move along, but we will definitely get them all answered by the end of the session. You may have seen this in the promotional copy, but we expect the outcomes of this webinar will allow you to do the following things. Learn the individual steps of strategic planning, realize the power of mission, vision, and values, discover the necessity of an environmental scan, learn the components of a strategic goal driven by metrics, incorporate design thinking within your strategy, turn a strategic plan into a work plan, and understand how to complement your development colleagues. While Scott and I consult in the alumni relations space specifically, we recognize that there are many attendees out there who are not in alumni relations, and we welcome you and we welcome our development colleagues as well. And many of you are also not in higher education. We've got folks from museums and healthcare and other great organizations. And we hope that our advice today is delivered in a universal context that you may utilize right away.
All right, well, let's get started with a pretty simple concept, and that is, where do you want to end up in this process? As consultants, we have learned that many organizations are doing things without really considering what they're trying to achieve. And so before starting a strategic plan, you need to ask yourself where it is you want to go with it. Or as Stephen Covey says, begin with the end in mind. Covey, of course, is one of our great business leaders, a guru of sorts. But with regards to this advice, he has a formidable peer, because a long time ago, the legendary thought leader Winnie the Pooh advised us to make sure we know what it is we're looking for. I think they're pretty much saying the same thing.
And who doesn't love Winnie the Pooh? So how does this apply to our work discussion today? Let's consider the reasons you may need a strategic plan, because each of these objectives may very well require you to tack in a slightly different direction. Firstly, is it a campaign? Campaigns are often a catalyst for strategic planning, whether it's at the beginning of a campaign or the end of a campaign. And actually, often for those of you in alumni relations, your most important work may very well be in the interim period where the pipeline for the next campaign has to be developed and nurtured, and the importance of your work is greatly elevated. The future is always going to be a destination, so how do you chart your course to get there? As consultants, we spend a lot of time speaking with colleagues who are very worried about the decreased investment in their alumni relations enterprise. Now more than ever, we must demonstrate the value, and you will see the planning process is a way to tease out a narrative that is useful for chancellors and others on the leadership team who don't always appreciate the long-term value of alumni relations. The next one is strategy. Strategy itself is a reason for planning. The impact of technology is forcing us to think of things in new ways. As practitioners, we need to direct ourselves and our resources in new and innovative ways to support our objectives, and this takes strategy. Another one is new organizational leadership. This can be a president or chancellor or a new vice president, a transition in the chief alumni officer role, whatever it may be. With change comes new priorities, and that can be a difficult conversation if you are already in the middle of a 5-year plan. But the reality is we all have bosses, and flexibility is incredibly important. Finally, does anyone out there have board members who do not understand their role? I know that never happens. Boy, do you need a plan, because this process can illustrate to them how they can be an asset in the organization with their noses in, but their fingers out of the process.
Well, let's talk about stakeholders now. If the constituents don't believe they have ownership of the plan, it's likely to fail. You know, Winston Churchill once said that plans themselves are of little importance, but planning is essential. And what he was trying to say is that the process is about engaging your constituents along the way. And for alumni professionals, think about how large that constituency is. It includes the alumni body itself, especially volunteers. You have the aforementioned university leadership, which must also include all your vice presidents. How about your alumni association staff, the team that's actually doing the work, academic deans, students, faculty, non-alumni friends, perhaps even the community, because our institutions are such a force in communities. What I'm describing here is that you often have a lot of mouths to feed, and a plan that is handed down from a small group of leaders will not have ownership. I'm reminded of a term I stumbled across in graduate school called the reluctant bureaucrat, and essentially it describes the low-level worker, maybe at the state level, who has to implement the rules and the laws that are created by legislative leaders. And the reluctant bureaucrat, if he or she doesn't agree with the rule or law, they can drag their feet, ignore the process, and essentially subvert the legislation, because the law is just words on paper and someone has to carry it out. You will have more success if your constituents believe that they have had a voice in the process.
All right, let's talk about the timeline, which is a good time to offer a disclaimer. There is no one single way to undertake strategic planning. There are many ways, as many ways as there are people watching this webinar today. We have chosen today a middle-of-the-road process, and that's not just because I'm Canadian, with the understanding and even encouragement that you have the license to mix and match. As consultants, we never present a one-size-fits-all approach. The work is always customized to the client's needs. That said, this isn't instant coffee, or as my colleagues in the South say, instant grits. You can expect to simmer the process for about 6 months to a year, and these are the basic steps that we will cover today. Discover, retreat, ideate, and implement.
And by discovery, we mean assessing where you are at as an organization. Not just where you think you are as an administrator or staff member, but even more importantly, where others think you are. And essentially, this is a scan of the environment, and it's one of the most useful exercises you will ever undertake.
The retreat phase. An effective planning process includes a manageably sized committee or task force that goes off to think deep thoughts, consuming the information obtained in advance in the discovery phase and talking about where they want to go next. This is about imagining.
Then the rubber meets the road in the ideate stage, crunching all the big ideas and then arriving at a handful of concrete priorities that will guide the work of your organization over the next 3 to 5 years.
Finally, there's implementation, turning your strategic plan into a work plan that is measurable and accountable. Again, feel free to send in questions as we go along. The first stop on this joyride is discovery.
You know, George Bernard Shaw, he gave us some great advice when he said, the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And this observation is at the heart of the discovery process. You know, in our lives, we know people who tend to give us their opinions too often, but the truth of the matter is, human beings are most often afraid to articulate what they're actually thinking, which is why the environmental scan is such an important tool in this process. It helps the organization find a common language with its constituents. And let me pause here to say, while you can conduct strategic planning on your own, and in fact, the tools that we're giving you today will help you in that process, this part of the planning, the environmental scan, is really where the value of outside counsel comes in, because the fidelity of responses will always be higher when a third party is asking the questions, especially if the interview subjects have something critical to say. And if you don't hear what others are honestly thinking, it's going to be difficult to craft a plan that addresses organizational challenges so they can be turned into organizational opportunities.
And here's some ways we do this. By organizational assessment, we mean review the structure of the team, the volunteers, budget, and programs to understand where the priorities currently lie. If you're at an institution of higher education, the institution's strategic plan should be considered in this phase. And actually, that's at any institution. A SWOT to assess the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We'll have more on that in a minute. Then face-to-face leadership interviews with the president, vice president, board executives, staff, and other key stakeholders. 30 minutes to an hour each with a set of common questions that will illuminate priorities and observations.
Now, a gap analysis can come out of those face-to-face interviews, but can also be done as an electronic survey to capture more data. We actually have a product that allows 100 to 200 respondents, the results of which can look something like this. And essentially, the process allows stakeholders to say, hey, this is what matters most to me. This is what I need most from your organization. And this is how well you're delivering it, in my opinion. So as we look at all of this, we should point out that some organizations also might want to survey all of the constituents. Let's say an alumni attitude survey, for instance, that returns a statistically relevant result. GG&A has a fabulous survey lab team that conducts alumni surveys more economically than anyone out in the market. And finally, a board self-assessment, which is especially useful if you're having difficulty getting your volunteers to fly at that 30,000-foot level and out of the weeds. And then finally, all of this data is aggregated into a situational analysis report. Let me just head off one question that's bound to be raised, and that is, Scott, is all of this discovery necessary? The answer is no, but it's about the level of fidelity to which you aspire. All of these things are going to be useful in capturing the truest picture of an organization, but the client must always be the one who decides what level is required.
Okay, let's look a little closer at the SWOT analysis. I'm sure each of us has gone through a process like this at some time or another. The strengths and weaknesses are usually internal forces, things we can control organizationally, while the opportunities and threats are usually external forces, but not always. What we like to do is code the responses and distill them into a single word that helps to visually express the sentiment in a word cloud. Of course, we also provide the detail of the responses, but this shows you how quickly you can assess the consensus. If you look at the top left, it makes sense that passion would be a strength of an organization, but in the bottom left, we can see that they can do a better job of collaborating across campus or with other organizational colleagues. This exercise helps to understand where the organization is at this very moment, but also where it can go. If you use it, make sure it's turned into action as part of the priorities that you eventually settle on in the strategic plan.
Next up is the retreat phase, which we mean both literally and metaphorically. Retreats provide an opportunity to step back, and ponder philosophically about the organization. The data has been gathered, and now we want to start to distill it into its finer essence with a strategic planning committee sequestered in a place where total focus can be applied. We talked about the fact earlier that one size does not fit all. We've seen committees as large as 75 or as small as the executive committee. It really depends on how your facilitator manages the group. But the working retreat provides a useful setting to do the following work in partnership with the planning committee that you select.
So first up, the beginning of the committee retreat should focus on setting a vision. And our advice here is to think big. Albert himself suggested your vision should be so grand in its scope that some might call it absurd. The vision statement is one sentence that describes where you want to be when the strategic plan you're working on reaches its conclusion. It's a crystal ball that looks into the future, and there is scientific evidence to back it up. In 1987, a couple of professors at Case Western Reserve came up with the concept of appreciative inquiry, and it became an important management tool for facilitating change. AI is defined partially as the collective design of a desired future state. And collective, meaning the group, is articulating where it wants to go. Then a goal so compelling that it does not require the use of incentives, coercion, or persuasion for plan change to occur. You can see how powerful then a vision statement can be, how actionable, I can't even say that word, how actionable if you do it well. So how's about some examples? The National Multiple Sclerosis Society, a world free of MS, just 5 words. The Nature Conservancy, to leave a sustainable world for future generations, 8 words. Habitat for Humanity, a world where everyone has a place to live, 10 words. Do you see how these statements are an end of themselves? These organizations are envisioning a day when they go out of business because their work is no longer needed. I can't tell you how many vision statements I read where the text is present tense, explaining what needs to be done instead of articulating an aspirational end.
Our friend Susan DeMuth from Johns Hopkins is asking if this deck is going to be available after the webinar, and Susan, indeed, it will be. We'll make sure that everyone gets a copy. If the vision statement is looking down the road, then the mission statement is examining the present. It has been said that the most important question you can ever ask is why, and the mission statement is essentially explaining why your organization exists, hopefully in one sentence. We'll have more on that in a second. But at this point, it's a good opportunity to engage this planning committee that you've selected, engage them in an important exercise around the question of why. Going around the table and asking first, why are you involved with this organization? And then once you've done that, go around a second time and ask, why do you think the organization wants you involved? 2 questions from 2 perspectives.
The reason this is important, and especially in the alumni space, is because we often find organizations with an imbalance in this equation. Our alumni relations practice is currently working with a client in Europe who has tilted all of its resources to what the alumni population want, with no regard to what the alumni can do for the institution. At the same time, we hear from alumni who say the only thing the institution wants from me is my money. The optimal space in which an alumni organization should operate is in the middle, in what we call mutually beneficial relationship. Why are the alumni involved? Why does the institution want them involved? Those 2 answers meet in the middle for success. And there's actually a formula for mission statements, and here it is. Action plus targeted beneficiary equals mission. In more practical terms, why you exist and who you exist for.
Now, for non-alumni folks who are out there, this is where you can also add in additional components to your mission through services that you provide or problems that you solve or others with whom you partner. But a caution here, remember, we said the definition of the mission statement should be stated in 1 sentence. How many mission statements have you seen that are 3 or 4 sentences, maybe even a paragraph? What are the chances of anyone in your organization remembering something that lengthy? If no one remembers it, how actionable can it be? So here's our advice. Simply, the mission statement should fit on a t-shirt and your volunteers should be willing to wear it. Now, think it can't be done? Let's take a look at a few. Let's start with TED. How many of us enjoy tuning into those TED Talks? What do you think their mission statement is? How about this? Spreading ideas. 2 words. The Humane Society. Celebrating animals, confronting cruelty. 4 words. An aquarium. To inspire, the Smithsonian first. The increase in diffusion of knowledge, just 6 words. Monterey Bay Aquarium, to inspire conservation of the ocean, 6 words. And finally, the Wounded Warrior Project, to honor and empower wounded warriors. So you see how this last one follows the formula that we outlined. The actions, we talked about the actions, they are honor and empower, and the beneficiary, wounded warriors. So we're throwing down a challenge to all of you to see if your mission can come in under 10 words. And we're going to start with, listen, our own GG&A. Our mission is advancing yours. It's just 5 words. And if you can get it within these confines, you can do so much more with it. It could be on the back of your business cards, as a tagline under your headline on your website. It, in fact, can become the calling card for your organization. So that's the challenge.
I'm just going to interrupt there with a question that came in. It came from Mark Kemble from OHSU, one of our wonderful clients. As alumni directors, we often address our our alumni by school or other identifying components. Is this work that should be done collectively by the school or collectively with mini plans customized by school? The answer I would offer to that is that it'd be very important to do it as the overarching organization, setting the big picture, setting the big vision, and setting the sort of core principles and values that we'll talk about, and then creating the mini customized plans for each school so that everything all dovetails together. And always happy to talk more about that. So let's step back for a moment and look at this from a strategic level. You can see on the pyramid where the vision and mission form the leading edge of your work. The meat of the plan, goals and objectives are still to come. But along the bottom, the entire structure has a foundation built on values. And that's our next exercise. Core values should describe the collective attitudes and belief you desire. Key words here is desire. So think about your organization. What do you believe in? Here is a list of potential values. We could create 10 more lists this size. The idea here is to get you thinking.
Let's show you how to actualize this in the context of some other things that we've talked about. We had a client go through an environmental scan, and one of the things we uncovered during that process was a concern about the commitment of some board members. You know, they attended meetings sporadically. They would indicate that they were going to show up at a particular event, volunteer for a particular aspect of the work, and then didn't. So during the retreat, we had the opportunity to introduce this concern that we uncovered in the environmental scan. We had the opportunity to introduce it in the form of stating a new value. And so here are some of the values that could have been chosen. I don't remember which one they in fact chose, but it started a conversation around the idea of holding each other accountable. And through that conversation, the board members agreed that they were comfortable with a fellow volunteer holding them accountable for what they said they would do. And this was a way for the board in that very moment to take ownership of its own actions. So all of you who have staff managing a board, how often do you have to play policeman, right? Well, what happens if you could create an environment when your board polices itself? So the value statement can speak to qualities that you desire in your organization, not necessarily ones that exist today, but the ones that we want our organization to value. How is that for progress?
I like it. I'm just going to stop again for a quick question. This is from Beth Delaney, and she's asking, can you provide resources for an environmental scan? And also, how can you identify future threats or trends that are not known? So yes, happy to talk about resources for environmental scans. We have talked briefly about interviews, which is very, very powerful. One-to-one interviews. We've also talked about research and having a research study done. And you can do that. You can work with organizations like ourselves, or you can just do a Survey Monkey. There's lots of ways to do that, and there's other tools you can use as well. The other question is about identifying future threats or trends that are not known. This is something we'll talk a little bit about later, but it's really important, I think, to also bring into play, and it can be done very much at the environmental scan, is a scenario planning. So looking at the future from 4 different perspectives and creating a scenario around each one of those perspectives. Often planning is done in a linear fashion, with sort of sometimes a group think around what the future holds, and everyone assuming the same assumptions. And often, though, where you have leadership or certain people with certain assumptions for the future, or actually have knowledge and information, that others in the room, either they don't share those assumptions or they don't have that knowledge. So sometimes plans can end up in the garbage can 6 months later because the world has turned out very different than the assumptions that were made. So I hope that's helpful. Okay, so we're about to transition from the philosophical to the practical. The rubber meeting the road in the next section we call ideate. I like to use a design thinking rubrics that lays the foundation for a flexible, creative approach to your strategic planning. The core of design thinking is all about being creative, but based on research and testing ideas, knowing that a few are going to fail. Design thinking can be a good framework for your ideation conversations, and there's no one way to do it. But it's important to have a facilitator so that you as the leader can sit back, think, and observe. A good facilitator can work with you to create a structure for your retreat that is fast and dynamic and pushing your people's thinking. Ideally, your participants have been spoon-fed from the research in advance and the work that has been done prior to the ideation session. You want to curate the group carefully and be very mindful about the dynamics and the agendas of each participant. The goal is to really work the group hard and truly problem solve and develop exciting solutions for the vision. You seriously want your participants' brains to hurt at the end of the day. I also like to use time boxing to do creative sprints with bazillions of yellow stickies. You will need to push people past their initial top 3 ideas because those are the easy ones. The magic comes at idea number 100. Also, sometimes having a graphic facilitator can be really engaging for the folks in the room. The resulting diagram can be an excellent way to share what came out of the session with the stakeholders who are not there. So it becomes your storyboard. It's great to have in the final report in your office and to add to a show, to show progress, and you can, add to it in years 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and I think it's over to you. I was going to say questions, but if anyone has any questions, please type them in. And otherwise, over to you, Mr. Atwell.
All right, so now it's time to take everything we've talked about and use the materials as building blocks to construct an actual strategic plan. And this is your license as an organizational leader to question all of the good ideas that come your way and say, wait a second, is this something that falls into one of our priorities in our strategic plan? It's your license to say no sometimes. You may have heard that if everything is important, then nothing is important. In fact, the definition of important is literally something that stands out as significant or profound. And the strategic plan is built to block out all of the white noise of our professional lives, to help us focus on the things that are important. All of the work that we've done up to this point, the environmental scan, the vision, mission, values, design thinking, should have identified 3 to 5 important areas in which your organization should be focusing. And we take those now into the plan. So here's a look at one framework for articulating a strategic priority. And again, there are many variations of this. We encourage you to mix and match to fit your unique needs. And we also suggest that in your final document that you include a glossary of the key terms that you're using. Because there's not a single nomenclature, you want to ensure that the stakeholders have a clear understanding of the language that's being used. Remember the phrase we used before, a common language. What one person might call an objective, another person might call a tactic, and you want to make sure that you all are speaking the same language. So at the top of this structure, we have the strategic goal or priority. This is the big picture. It's a goal that will help the organization reach the vision that we talked about earlier. Since the goal is just a brief sentence or a few words, we find it useful to add some context with a goal statement. We'll be giving you an example of this here just in a minute. The objectives box is for a list of the ways that you will pursue the goal. And these can be quantifiable, as you'll see. The tactics are specific actions that accomplish objectives, and the measurements will tell us if we're succeeding in pursuit of the goal. Of course, all of this seems basic. You may be saying, Scott, what am I getting out of this? Well, here's some value for you, especially those of you managing boards. This is a slide you want to show your board of directors, illustrating the 30,000-foot level from which they are expected to manage. And it's not always self-evident. I was speaking to an alumni director a couple months ago, and she was telling me about board members, okay, who would routinely call up staff and make requests for initiatives that they were pursuing individually, and how it created anxiety among the staff who, on the one hand, didn't want to disappoint the board members, but also were very confused about who they were working for. So we mentioned earlier the phrase, noses in, fingers out. These blue shaded areas are where the board is allowed to sniff around, but keep your fingers out of the tactics.
So let's give you a real life example of this. Here's a pretty common goal in alumni organizations, increasing the ability to track engagement outcomes. And here's a brief description. Stating that goal in more detail may look something like this. Counting for the sake of counting is not a strategic goal. We will create a system that identifies and measures desired outcomes from our alumni engagement. So, okay, how do we do that? How's about some objectives? Firstly, include an engagement metric in capital campaign, i.e. a dual goal campaign. 2, create a campus partnership that accounts for all alumni engagement, collaboration. 3, establish a 5-year goal with incremental benchmarks, giving you a time period. 4, identify desired outcomes and protocols for tracking. What is it we want to achieve and how do we measure it? That's where the board or strategic planning committee's work should end. After that, staff should have the free rein to decide how they can accomplish the goals and objectives based on the understanding of the unique limitations that are present, and every organization has limitations. Then, in conjunction with the board or committees, there should be an agreement on how the progress toward this particular goal will be measured. In this case, because the goal is about measurement, it is a measurement of the measuring.
And Barney, this bottom box is so critical because, if you're not careful, all of the boxes above will keep the staff busy, right? Busy with the appearance of getting things done. But the only way you're going to know if you're getting things done is through the measurements, which must articulate outcomes. So that box at the bottom is small in size, but huge in stature, and you must return to it often. Let me pause to say that I've seen some strategic plans that are so detailed they could be overwhelming to look at, especially for staff members. And that's why I find it helpful to give a timeline to some of these outcomes. So look at the bottom right here, for instance. It's okay to say this objective here is incremental. We can get that done this year. These next two going to take a little more work. Maybe we'll get that done the following year. And then finally, getting the president to buy in, into a dual goal campaign. That's transformative. It's going to take a couple of years of labor leading up to the campaign's launch. What this does is it allows you and your staff to breathe and to celebrate incremental victories along the path of achieving your vision. So if you use this column approach in your strategic planning, your committee should land on, let's say, 3 to 5 of these columns, maybe 6, but any more than that, you're really approaching that area where everything seems important and it's going to be difficult to find success.
That leads us to the final phase of planning, the implementation. By some estimations, 90% of strategic plans fail because of implementation strategy or lack thereof. As we have mentioned earlier, your plan is being created within the context of a larger institutional plan. So think of your plan as cascading down from the larger plan. And to ensure accountability, it needs to continue to cascade down into actual unit and individual work plans. These can be measured and monitored on at least a quarterly basis. This is where, in an ideal world, you have a person assigned to project management who can set up the structure and monitor the results. Ideally, they organize stoplight meetings once a month, or maybe once a quarter, where you review the progress with a green, amber, or red light by each tactic. The creation of a plan was an opportunity to engage stakeholders. After year 1, you want to ensure that you circle back to your stakeholders and share the good news of your success, the challenges, and possibly the failures. It's important to be transparent and acknowledge not everything went to plan. Ensure you tailor the message to each audience so it answers what's in it for me. If you are proud of your plan, put it on your website. You'll actually be amazed how many people read it, and it's also a great resource for the board.
All right, finally, we call this presentation the strategic plan for the strategic plan. So we had to deliver. And this is the cheat sheet for everything we've covered today. Now, you could make an argument that all 4 of these columns could be objectives under a single goal of design a strategic plan, but that would have created, in this case, a very vertical column. We wouldn't have been able to get it on the screen. So as a practical matter, we've listed it this way as 4 separate goals. Plan and scan the environment, articulate culture, identify priorities, and implement strategy, each with their own goal statement, objectives, tactics, and measurements.
A couple of specific points. Communication of this process is really, really vital. One of the very first things we mentioned in this presentation is the need to bring the entire constituency along for the ride. Even if they don't participate, they will have confidence in the process if you have given them the opportunity to participate. You must be very specific in explaining why you are going through the process and what you want to achieve and what role they can play. All of your steps should be transparent, and the final result communicated over and over again until you are frankly sick of talking about it.
Now, the actual working group will be much smaller as the process gets more granular. You have to get the right people on the bus and you get their commitment to meet in person at this retreat. I can tell you joining by phone doesn't work. If one of the folks that you really want on the committee can't be there in person, select another stakeholder who can be there. Use a doodle poll or whatever, some other kind of survey instrument on the date and the location. Imperative to make sure that these folks can be there in person.
This working group will have a lot of information to process. Data from the environmental scan, the relationships to the vision, and mission statements, design thinking, etc. Don't take your eye off the ball. This process started with a goal, and you must end with goals.
And finally, as mentioned before, the strategic plan has a reputation for being created with much fanfare, only to be placed on the shelf and never seen again. But here's how you can keep that from happening. Make sure that every one of the tactics in your plan has a line item in your budget, right? Every organization must formulate an annual budget. For those of you on a fiscal year, you're probably working on it right now. So when that time circles around each year, you're going to be required to make judgments on continuing to fund that line item or replace it with something else. So in this way, the strategic plan becomes a dynamic, living object contemplated each year in your budget and hopefully at least viewed monthly in your dashboard of measurements. Now, another way to assure accountability is to designate a responsible party for each of your objectives. Not an area of your enterprise, but a specific staff member. That way, there's never confusion about who has ownership of an activity.
Great point. I'm going to jump, before we jump into this one, I'm just going to answer a question from Adrian Davidson. Can you speak a little to the role of development advancement and /advancement in the implementation and execution stages of a strategic plan? I.e., most plans will identify a vision that will need money. Such a great question. It's really important at the very outset when you're doing your environmental scan to have conversations with your development team, and this is in universities and colleges and private schools, but it's also in museums, it's in healthcare, it's everywhere. You want to be sure that you're in a really strong relationship with them, and if you're not, as part of the scan, to start to dig into that and understand why. Then as you select your committee and your planning group, it's often an excellent idea to have someone from advancement at the table. And as you allude to, Adrian, some of your objectives will more than likely require funding. And so it's really important that there is ownership within your organization. It's not just assuming or making sure, just saying that, development will get us this much money, that there are strict plans in place for that and strategies to achieve that. I think it's also really important when you get down to the measurements that if it's on your alumni side or if you're in a museum and it's your membership side or it's a hospital and it's the patient side, that there are shared metrics, that the alumni side of the house has metrics for engaging donors and for stewarding donors and maybe how many prospects you pass on. And likewise on the development side of the house, that they have alumni engagement metrics. How many alumni, amazing volunteers are they sending your way? How many events are they attending? What type of presence are they going to have? How are they weaving alumni messaging into all of their communications? So super important to be doing this in a really, really integrated fashion.
Barney, can I interject one thing real quickly?
No, absolutely not.
Adrian also points out that she says that most plans will identify a vision that will need money. But I would point back to some of the vision statements, for instance, the MS Society, a world free of MS. So their vision isn't that we want to raise money to cure MS, but their vision is a world free of MS. So what is the end game? What do you want to look down the road 5 years and identify that your work has achieved? So if you focus on the end goal, then the process of raising money to reach that goal becomes more clear.
Yeah, that's a great point. So let's jump into the next part, which is after the last webinar, and we had about 70 people participate, which was awesome. We got some feedback from folks because we were doing some follow-ups. Be warned, you're going to hear from us. And they were asked to include some pitfalls. And some of this is what we've already mentioned, but it's a nice, we thought we'd give you 10 as a summary of some of the things we talked about. So number one, not getting support early from the people who matter. This includes the people who are part of the environmental scan and also the manner in which you conduct the retreat.
Number two, ineffective pre-planning. Did you adequately think through the people who needed to be on the bus? Did you plan for all of the discovery opportunities?
Number three, failing to address and resolve current problems. Encourage your team to document the trouble spots in real time as they move through their days. Take a long, hard look at the bottlenecks and obstacles that are bogging down your current system's productivity and efficiency. And a lot of this will come up in your SWOT analysis. By coming to terms and working through your current problems first, you can better lay the groundwork for success with your new strategic initiatives now and in the future.
We talked about trying to do everything immediately as a common pitfall. So as we mentioned, it could be tempting to try to front load all of the action items into the first few months, but doing this rarely works. The most effective plans are those which have realistic time and resource allocation.
Number five, developing mission, vision, values, statements that lack substance. If these ultimate goals are not clear, what results will the strategic plan achieve, no matter how well it's laid out?
Next is maybe the plan didn't emphasize accountability. The people doing the operational planning must understand from their teams what is actually required in the doing to ensure that realistic timelines, for instance, are being set with adequate resources, right? Being directed to a strategy initiative to ensure its achievement. This is why we believe the tactics should be articulated by the staff. And then after that, the measurements should be attributed to the responsible staff member.
Next up is missing the things you could have predicted. So planning for a predictable future, the only constant is change. So it's important to use tools like scenario planning to ensure the planning you do is based upon a shared belief in the most likely future scenario for the organization and the society that it is serving. And so by this, I also mean you want to have thought through the other possible scenarios. And sometimes you have to have sort of emergency backup plans for those scenarios. If you've done this type of pre-planning, if the landscape does shift, then you actually have a document you can go back to, and you may have done some pre-thinking that could be very, very valuable.
Number 8 is vague action steps. Without action steps, the big picture strategy is going to be useless. So to develop these steps, the team has to identify the actions that are necessary to implement the strategy. Let me give you an example. Let's say one element of your plan is to, quote, be recognized as a thought leader in what are XYZ, let's say museum work, okay? So that's an easy thing to claim, but it's useless without something concrete to do. So you may, in fact, say that the action steps to reach that will be specifically that you want to write a blog for XYZ magazine 5 times a month, okay? If your strategic plan fails to define what the management team does every day, it needs good action steps.
And every aspect of our lives is measured these days, but constituent relations is just getting its arm around understanding how to quantify the work that we do, so our practice is knee-deep in metrics conversations. It's something we do a lot. Our work does not go out the door. Oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. I jumped to the wrong one. Sorry about that. Failure to communicate broadly. If the tree falls and no one is there to hear it, you know the rest. Everyone in your universe should be kept apprised of the process. Once the plan is complete, schedule regular updates and results of the measurements. And this leads us to the final one, not tracking progress effectively. As we mentioned, connecting the plan to the budget ensures that the priorities you set will be reviewed each year, but you should have a dashboard that allows you to see progress incrementally, in my world, ideally each month. So we'd like to jump to questions. We've got a couple minutes left, about 5 minutes left, and we have one from an anonymous attendee. Our board chair would like the university president to attend the retreat. Is this a good idea? Will it impact on the honesty of what is shared? Oof, that's a loaded one. Often it will take careful thinking about, are there current hot issues with the board that you don't want to have explode in the room with the president there. So if there are issues of concern, it might not be the best idea to have the president there, as the retreat might be part of the process of figuring solutions to those issues. But it may conversely be a great way for the board to hear the president speak firsthand and to have the president hear from the board members, and really improve communication and awareness from both sides. It's a tricky balance, though, of when you have folks like the president in the room, to try and level the playing field so that job titles are left at the door, and people are just there from their passion for the organization perspective rather than their role. And this often is something that the facilitator will need to reinforce. So there's no one answer to that question. It's not black or white. In general, I think it's good to have the most senior leadership in the room, because then they really understand the thought process and they themselves would be contributing to the strategy. So it can be very powerful to have them there, but you certainly don't, if there's any massive elephants that are going to be coming in the room and joining them and hiding under the rug when they're there, you may want to deal with those in advance.
Yeah. Let me extend the thinking. Without question, the president's viewpoint will be included in the dialogue via the environmental scan, right? So what the president thinks about the work that's being done, the priorities that the organization should be considering, all of that information is going to come in via the environmental scan. And I believe it's best to obtain that information really in a smaller group setting. So for instance, the consultant one-on-one, getting honest feedback. Now, I do think it's a great idea to have the president come and address this planning committee at the start of their work, to illustrate that from the highest levels of the institution or the organization, that it has the support and that it's important, and he or she looks forward to the results. So having them address at the beginning, great idea. And my guess is that that their viewpoints are going to be part of the conversation from the environmental scan.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free to type away.
All right. While we'll wait for some more questions, but at the same time, we'll give you a little background on GG&A and our practice. We're a team of 3, including the incredibly talented consulting associate Megan Williamson, who works out of our Chicago office. Since I'm based on the East Coast, Barney's based on the West Coast, we are, if nothing else, geographically balanced.
And balanced from the perspective of the clients we serve. Here's a listing of the organizations with whom the Alumni Relations practice is partnered, and you'll see they span the globe. Constituent relations and philanthropy are worldwide interests, and GG&A is a worldwide consulting firm.
We help our clients in many ways. Often it is a customized review of a program that helps the organization understand how it stacks up against peers, which is helpful, let's say, when you're lobbying for additional support from the people upstairs. And of course, we provide strategic planning counsel.
Who knew? Every aspect of our lives is measured these days, but constituent relations is just getting its arm around understanding how to quantify the work that we do. So our practice is knee-deep in the metrics conversations, as we've mentioned, specifically outcomes measurements. Our work does not go out the door with some form of data component, and for that we turn to our talented analytics colleagues in the firm who design and conduct surveys and crunch data in every imaginable way. We also provide ongoing counsel, in addition to training and workshops, and finally, dual goal campaigns, which is something I've been involved in at a number of institutions, where they've elevated the non-monetary engagement goals right alongside the big, scary dollar goal.
All right, my friend, it's great joining you again, Barney, and for all of you out there in viewing land, we appreciate your time. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. As we said, at GG&A, our mission is advancing yours. Good luck with your strategic planning. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone, for participating. That was awesome.